1914 to 1980. Between 1914 and 1980, inequalities in income and wealth decreased markedly in the Western world as a whole. The United Kingdom, Germany, France, Sweden, and the United States, and in Japan, Russia, China, and India, although in different ways, which we will explore in a later chapter. Here we will focus on the Western countries and improve our understanding of how this Great Redistribution took place. The first factor was the welfare state's spectacular rise in power. This long-term development was in large measure the result of social struggles and mobilization of the socialist and labor movements since the end of the 19th century. Nevertheless, it was greatly accelerated by the two world wars and the Depression following the stock market crash of 1929. Three events that in the 3 decades between 1914 and 1945 completely overturned the power relationships between labor and capital. The second factor was the development of a very progressive tax on income and inheritance, which made it possible to massively reduce the concentration of wealth and economic power at the apex of the social hierarchy, while at the same time favoring increased mobility and greater prosperity. The progressive tax played a decisive role in defining a new social and fiscal contract. Finally, we shall see the essential role played by the liquidation of foreign and colonial assets, and how the dissolution of public debt helped to reduce inequalities and destroy perceptions of private property as sacred. Rivalries among European powers and the intolerable character of the inegalitarian colonial regime were critical ingredients in the subsequent fall of Belle Epoque societies dominated by property owners. The way in which Europe was reconstructed after World War I, by cancellation of its debts, also imparted lessons for the future. The invention of the welfare state, education, healthcare, and social security. Between 1914 and 1980, the power of the fiscal and social state was to undergo an unprecedented expansion in all Western countries. At the end of the 19th century and at the beginning of the 20th century, total tax receipts, including taxes, contributions, and obligatory levies of all kinds, represented less than 10% of the national income in Europe and the United States. Between 1914 and 1980, this tax burden tripled in the United States and more than quadrupled in Europe. In France, Germany, Sweden, and the United Kingdom, tax receipts have amounted to between 40 and 50% of the national income since the 1980s and 1990s. Numerous studies have shown that the fiscal state's rise in power made a major contribution to the process of economic development. The new receipts did in fact make it possible to finance expenditures that proved indispensable not only for reducing inequalities, but also for encouraging growth. These expenditures included a massive and relatively egalitarian investment in education and healthcare, or at least a much more massive and egalitarian investment than any previous, expansion of transportation and other community infrastructure, the replacement income, such as retirement pensions, necessary for supporting an aging population, and reserves, such as unemployment insurance, for stabilizing the economy and society in the event of a recession. If we examine the main European nations, we find that the increase in tax receipts is explained almost entirely by the rise of social welfare expenditures related to education, healthcare, retirement pensions, and other transfers. See Figure 19 in the PDF. This transformation of the role of the state through increased tax receipts and expenditures accelerated between 1914 and 1950. On the eve of World War I, as in the 19th century, the focus of the European state was centered on the maintenance of order and respect for the right of property, on the domestic terrain as well as on the interstate and colonial scene. State expenses for the army, the police, the judicial system, general administration, and basic infrastructure consumed almost all the tax revenues, or about 8% of the national income, out of a total of scarcely 10%. Other expenses, notably social welfare expenses, had to make do with a bare 2% of the national income, of which less than 1% went for education. Conversely, at the beginning of the 1950s, the essential components of the welfare state were in place in Europe, with total receipts exceeding 30% of the national income and a diversified set of expenditures for education and welfare that then consumed 2/3 of the total. This upward trend for social welfare expenditures continued between 1950 and 1980. We must emphasize the capital importance of expenditures for education, both as a factor of equality and as a force driving development. At the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th, schools were extremely elitist and hierarchized. Only a small minority of the population could hope to receive more than a primary education and the first years of secondary education. Expenditures for education began to grow between 1870 and 1910, while generally remaining between 0.5% and 1% of the national income, with the United States clearly ahead and the United Kingdom just as clearly behind. In 1870, public expenditures for education, all levels taken together, represented 0.7% of the national income in the United States, 0.4% in France, and 0.2% in the United Kingdom. In 1910, they rose to 1.4% in the United States, 1% in France, and 0.7% in the United Kingdom. In comparison, military budgets reached or exceeded 4 to 5% of the national income in Europe in the 19th century and at the beginning of the 20th century. On the global level, military expenditures fell from more than 6% of the national income in 1960, colonial wars, the Cold War, to 3% in 2020, 2% in Europe, 4% in the United States, 10% in Saudi Arabia. Then the investment in education grew almost tenfold in the course of the 20th century and reached about 6% of the national income in all Western countries during the 1980s and 1990s, making it possible to finance almost universal access to secondary education, with a clear advance in access to higher education. Within this general landscape marked by the expansion of education, the United States edge was particularly prominent around the middle of the 20th century. In the 1950s, the proportion of children aged 12 to 17, boys and girls taken together, enrolled in secondary education was already almost 80% in the United States. At the same time, the rate of enrollment in secondary schools was between 20 and 30% in the United Kingdom and France, and barely reached 40% in Germany and Sweden. In these four countries, the high rates of enrollment in secondary schools seen in the United States in the 1950s were not reached until the 1980s and 1990s. In the 19th century, we find the same gap in primary school enrollments. Around 1850, enrollments exceeded 80% in the United States, whereas in Germany, France, and the United Kingdom, similar rates of enrollment were not reached until 1890 to 1910. Japan, in an exacerbated competition with Western powers, had already distinguished itself by its accelerated educational expansion between 1880 and 1930, and soon matched and exceeded Western figures with secondary school enrollments reaching 60% in the 1950s and more than 80% in the early 1970s. Generally speaking, at the end of the 19th century, governments were beginning to realize that education and training are a factor in national power, and not simply a matter of equality and individual emancipation. The Second Industrial Revolution, which unfolded between 1880 and 1940 in chemical industries, the steel industry, the production of electricity, the automobile industry, and the manufacture of household appliances, required much more job training. During the First Industrial Revolution, and particularly in the textile and coal industries, one could get along with a relatively mechanized workforce, overseen by foremen and a few engineers. During the Second Industrial Revolution, it became essential that an increasingly large part of the labor force be capable of mastering manufacturing processes that required technical and digital education, and the ability to understand detailed equipment manuals. That was how the United States, followed by Germany and Japan, who were newcomers on the international scene, gradually surpassed the United Kingdom in the new industrial sectors. The considerable gap observed between the United States and the rest of the Western world in terms of the productivity of labor in the middle of the 20th century can be explained to a considerable extent by the United States' lead in education. This lead was overcome in the course of the following decades, as was the lead in productivity. Since the 1980s to 1990s, the GDP per hour worked is almost exactly the same in the United States, Germany, and France. Note in passing the importance of the choice of socioeconomic indicators. Time spent at work is ignored in this kind of comparison, a debatable if widespread choice that fails to account for immense historical progress toward increased leisure time, paid vacations, and a reduced work week, even though this question has been at the heart of popular and labor union mobilizations over the past 2 centuries. The historical movement demanding a reduction of the length of the work week was also very important in the United States, but considerably weaker than in Europe, a fact which can be connected with the more limited development of the welfare state in general in the United States. The fiscal state's second leap forward, an anthropological revolution. We must also emphasize the deep difference in nature between the fiscal state's first leap forward and its second. At the time of the first leap forward, between 1700 and 1850, when the principal European powers had moved from about 1 to 2% of the national income in tax receipts to approximately 6 to 8%, this advance corresponded chiefly to the growth of military and state expenditures. The state was controlled by the aristocratic and bourgeois elites and was situated in the vanguard of interstate competition and commercial and colonial expansion. Between 1914 and 1980, growth of the state was led by social welfare expenditures. Considerations of power were never entirely absent, but this unprecedented extension of the state's role took place primarily for the benefit of the lower and middle classes, and in large measure under their control, or at least under that of the political movements that represented them and that they had elected, under conditions entirely unprecedented in history. In the United Kingdom, the Labour Party thus won an absolute majority of the seats in the elections of 1945. The National Health Service, NHS, and a vast system of social welfare insurance followed. The most aristocratic country in Europe, which until the constitutional crisis of 1909 had been governed by the House of Lords, it became a country in which a party both authentically popular and labor-focused came to power and put its reforms in place. In Sweden, the country where until 1910 property owners had 100 voting rights, workers kept the Social Democrats in power more or less continuously starting in 1932. In France, in 1936, the Popular Front set up paid vacations, and the strong presence of communists and socialists in the parliament and the government made it possible to establish a system of social security in 1945. In the United States, a popular coalition carried the Democrats and the New Deal to power in 1932 and posed a long-lasting challenge to the dogmas of laissez-faire and the power of economic and financial elites. From 1950 to 1980, the Labor, Social Democratic, Socialist, Communist, and Democratic parties continued to bring together the popular vote, no matter which dimension of social stratification is selected: income, education, property. These coalitions gradually fell apart starting in 1980 to 1990, and this can be connected with the fact that the redistributive platforms became less ambitious. The anthropological revolution was twofold. For the first time in history on this scale, the state escaped the exclusive control of the dominant classes. This was a result of universal suffrage, parliamentary and representative democracy, the electoral process, and frequent changes of power among different political parties, the whole spurred on by an independent press and the labor union movement. This political system remains eminently perfectible, if necessary by means of major constitutional revisions, but everyone now knows that progress must emanate from egalitarian roots and electoral democracy. Acknowledgement of this fact in the 1970s to 1980s contributed to the final delegitimation of the communist countermodel. If the latter produces both less political freedom and less social and economic well-being, then what's the point? The second lesson is that it is possible to move beyond not only censitary government, but also capitalism and generalized commodification. Vast sectors of the economy, starting with education and healthcare, and to a considerable extent transportation and energy as well, have been organized outside commercial logic, with various systems of public employment, mutualist or nonprofit structures, subsidies and investments financed by tax revenues. Not only has this worked, but it has worked much more efficiently than in the private capitalist sector. Even if some lobbyists in the United States continue to claim the contrary, for obvious reasons, and unfortunately sometimes with a certain efficacy, everyone who cares about facts now knows that public healthcare systems on the European model are both less expensive and more efficient, in terms of well-being and life expectancy, than the private companies in the United States. In the education sector, hardly anyone is proposing to replace elementary schools, secondary schools, or higher education with corporations governed by the logic of capitalism. Something like this was tried in Chile after 1973, and also in the United States more recently, with for-profit universities such as Trump University. In both cases, the quest for profit undermined the ethical motivations on which education is founded. Similar results are found in healthcare and many other sectors, such as media and culture. Whatever the legitimate criticisms and debates regarding improvements to be made or whether a further expansion is advisable, no political movement of significant scope in countries that have experienced the rise of the fiscal and welfare state in the course of the 20th century is proposing a return to a pre-1914 situation, when tax receipts represented less than 10% of the national income. The invention of the progressive tax on income and inheritance. Let us now come to the question of progressive taxation. Until the beginning of the 20th century, almost all the world's fiscal systems were clearly regressive, in the sense that they were usually based on sales taxes and indirect taxes representing a proportionately heavier burden on the poorest people than on the wealthiest. The most extreme case of a regressive tax is the poll tax or capitation, which is a tax of a fixed amount for everyone. By definition, it represents a proportion of a low-paid employee's income 10 times larger than that of a manager with a salary 10 times higher. The poll tax in the United Kingdom, defended in 1988 by Margaret Thatcher, was so unpopular that the Tory party had to abandon the project in 1990 and choose a new prime minister. A proportional tax is a tax representing a set percentage of income or assets to be paid by all social classes. Conversely, a progressive tax is characterized by a rate of taxation that rises as income or wealth rises. It will be noted that the regressivity or progressivity of a tax can be defined in relation to the level of income or the level of wealth. Both approaches are pertinent and complement one another, because income and wealth constitute two complementary indicators of an individual's ability to contribute. The debates regarding progressive taxes have a long history. They became more important in the 18th century, especially during the French Revolution, when many pamphlets proposed systems quite close to the taxes on income that would finally be implemented on a large scale in the 20th century. In 1767, the town planner Jean-Joseph Louis Grolin defended the idea of a tax scale in which an income equal to half the average income would be subject to an effective tax rate of 5%, whereas a taxpayer with an income equal to 1,300 times the average income would have to pay a tax of 75%. In 1792, the tax official Lacoste proposed a similar system for the inheritance tax. Small legacies would pay a 6% tax, and the larger ones a tax of 67%. See Table 1 in the PDF. But with the exception of 1793 to 1794, when progressive tax scales were briefly implemented, the Revolution finally adopted proportional or regressive taxes. All through the 19th century, parents' legacies to their children were taxed at a rate of 1%, no matter what the amount. Taxes were higher for legacies to brothers and sisters, cousins, and persons outside the family, but remained independent of the amount. This rejection of progressivity helps explain the increase in the concentration of property up to 1914. It was not until the beginning of the 20th century that progressive taxes were established more or less everywhere within the space of a few years. In the United States, the top tax rate for the federal income tax, that is, the rate applicable to the highest incomes, rose from 7% in 1913 to 77% in 1918, and eventually reached 94% in 1944. See Figure 20 in the PDF. From 1932 to 1980, nearly half a century, the average top rate was 81%. Although the United States took the lead, we also see spectacular development of both progressive income taxes and progressive inheritance taxes in the United Kingdom, Germany, France, Sweden, and Japan. See Figure 21 in the PDF. Could progressive taxes have been so quickly established without the shock of World War I and without the Bolshevik regime's pressure on the elites in capitalist countries? Strictly speaking, it is impossible to answer that question. The history of the world since 1914 has been so completely altered by World War I and the events that issued from it, starting with the Russian Revolution in 1917, that it no longer makes sense to imagine a 20th century without the interwar period, the USSR, and the Cold War. The invention of progressive taxation must nevertheless be seen as the consequence of both a social and political movement and a long-term protest movement. This process was accelerated, of course, by multiple events: wars, revolutions, economic crises. But the relative importance of the latter varies greatly depending on the country. And we must remember, above all, that these events themselves did not just appear out of the blue. They were in large measure the product of the enormously strong social and inegalitarian tensions of the time. In the case of France, it is striking to note that parliamentary groups decided to raise the top tax rate to 60% in the early 1920s, even with power held by a conservative majority, the National Bloc, one of the most right-wing political groups in the history of the French Republic. Before the war, the same groups rejected a 5% income tax and then used every means at their disposal to block its adoption. Before World War I, the Republican elites used and abused this argument. France had been made egalitarian thanks to revolution in 1789, and thus didn't need a progressive tax, even though data available at the time clearly demonstrated the extreme concentration of wealth. If we include the 25% supplement that unmarried people had to pay, and the 10% supplement for married couples with no children after 2 years of marriage, proof of government's fiscal imagination, also adopted in 1920 by the National Bloc, then the top rate reaches 75% in 1923 and 90% in 1924, after final supplements approved by the coalition of the left, for good measure. A few years later, it almost seemed as if political affiliation mattered little in a political context completely transformed by war and destruction, with millions dead and wounded. Post-war workers' wages still had not recovered the purchasing power they possessed in 1914, nor did they when several waves of strikes threatened the country with paralysis in May and June 1919, nor again in the spring of 1920. Remedies had to be found, and no one imagined that the richest people would be spared. The socialist and communist danger played an obvious role here. Elites considered it safer to accept a very progressive tax than to run the risk of someday being faced with general expropriation. But that does not mean, of course, that this same threat might have materialized even without the assassination in Sarajevo or the seizure of the Winter Palace. Movements favoring fiscal progressivity were already becoming more powerful before the war, and the conflict that followed probably only lit the match. The creation of a progressive tax on inheritance, Law of 25 February 1901, preceded that of the progressive tax on income, Law of 15 July 1914, which was long blocked by the Senate after it was adopted by the deputies in 1909 and finally passed to finance the war. The crucial importance of social and political movements is confirmed by studies on other countries. Sweden's hypersensitary system was challenged as early as 1909 to 1911. The country was relatively little affected by the two world wars, and it was above all the Social Democrats coming to power that was decisive for the establishment of both the welfare state and progressive taxation. In the United Kingdom, the People's Budget of 1909 combined strongly progressive taxation with social welfare programs, overcoming opposition from the House of Lords and ultimately limiting their power in 1911. In the United States, the federal income tax was established in 1913. This event had nothing to do with World War I. Rather, it was the outcome of a long process of constitutional amendment that began in 1895. Its passage testifies to the strength of the progressive movement and the demand for fiscal and economic justice that was being expressed in the country at that time. The process of revision was represented both by the Democrats, who had been censured by the Supreme Court in 1895, and the People's Party, or Populist Party, which was then defending a platform of land sharing, credit for small farmers, and opposition to the takeover of the country's government by stockholders, property owners, and large corporations. We must also stress the central role played by the stock market crash of 1929, an event more decisive and traumatizing in the United States than World War I or the Russian Revolution. The crisis made clear to everyone the need to regain control of capitalism, and led Roosevelt to push fiscal progressivity to unprecedented levels in the 1930s and 1940s. Real progressivity and the social contract. The question of consent to taxation. What were the real economic effects of fiscal progressivity? Here we must put an end to a widely accepted notion that the highest tax rates were never applied to anyone and had no substantial effect. It is true that the 70% or 80% tax rates affected only a small minority, generally the richest 1%, or even 0.1%. The rate higher than 70 or 80% may be either a marginal rate that applies to the fraction of income or assets above this threshold, or an effective rate, which then applies to total income or assets. Tax scales expressed directly in an effective rate were used notably by the Popular Front in its fiscal reform of 1936. They have the immense advantage of being more transparent and democratic. Everyone understands more clearly who pays what and sees that income or assets must be very high indeed for effective rates to reach substantial levels. But the fact is that at the beginning of the 20th century, the distribution of incomes, and especially of properties, was extremely concentrated. The richest 1% held more than half the total wealth in France, and almost two-thirds in the United Kingdom. The richest 0.01% held more than a quarter of the wealth in France, and more than a third in the United Kingdom. If we exclude housing, and focus on the ownership of the means of production, the concentration appears even greater. In other words, even if the 70 and 80% tax rates concerned only the top 100th or 1,000th, these very restricted groups had considerable weight in the inegalitarian regime that characterized the property-owning societies of the Belle Époque. A meticulous examination of French inheritance archives on the individual level enables us to see to what point progressive taxation of incomes and inheritances has weighed heavily in favor of the deconcentration of property that occurred between 1914 and 1950. In the case of the United States, if we take into account all the levies, the federal income tax, but also all the other taxes and duties at all levels of government, we can see that the fiscal system was very strongly progressive between 1914 and 1980. Concretely, the effective tax rates paid by the least wealthy 90% were considerably lower than the country's average tax rate, whereas the effective rates paid by the richest 1,000th and 10,000th reached 60 to 70%, or more than 3 times the average rate. See Figure 22 in the PDF. Here we also take into account the tax on corporations, attributed to the different centile of the stockholders concerned, property tax, attributed to the centiles of property owners, taxes on consumption, attributed to the centiles of consumers, and so on. The data available for European countries confirm this conclusion. In other words, during this period, effective fiscal progressivity was a massive and inescapable reality. This strong progressivity had several consequences. First, it reduced inequality and led to a decline in the concentration of income and property among the most well-off. And second, it altered overall the social contract and increased collective acceptance of higher taxes and greater socialization of wealth. Between 1914 and 1980, modest and middle-level taxpayers, salaried employees, independent workers, or owners of small and medium-sized companies could be certain that the most well-off economic actors, individuals with large incomes, many assets, and more prosperous companies, would be asked to pay taxes at a rate considerably higher than theirs. Today, the situation is completely different. Real progressivity has disappeared when it has not been transformed into regressivity, in the sense that the wealthiest people sometimes succeed in paying taxes at effective rates lower than those paid by the middle and lower classes, and large companies often succeed in paying at a tax rate lower than that of small and medium-sized companies. Thus, in 2018 to 2019, the effective rate paid by the 400 largest taxpayers in the United States fell below that paid by less wealthy taxpayers. These estimates do not take into account what is directly observable, and largely ignore the sophisticated strategies for optimizing and avoiding taxes. This poses a serious risk to the political acceptability of taxation and the legitimacy of the system of social solidarity as a whole. Progressive taxation, a tool for reducing inequalities before taxes. Here we must underline another essential lesson to be learned from the period 1914 to 1980, namely that fiscal progressivity made it possible to reduce inequalities not only after taxes, but also and especially before taxes, sometimes called predistribution, in contrast to redistribution. This conclusion may seem paradoxical, but in reality it is rather obvious. It is particularly clear in the case of progressive inheritance taxes, which reduce inequalities in fortune to the following generation. It would be even clearer if the inheritance tax were used to redistribute the legacy to the benefit of all those who inherit next to nothing, and if the annual wealth tax were also used to implement a permanent redistribution of capital. That is also the case for the progressive income tax, especially with almost confiscatory rates of 80 to 90% for the highest incomes. If high incomes proceeded from capital, dividends, interest, rents, etc., as many of them did during the Belle Époque and the interwar period, then such rates compelled the very wealthy to adopt a less extravagant way of life, because if they did not, they ran the risk of finding themselves forced to amputate their capital irremediably by selling off an increasing portion of their enterprises and goods. This effect played a role in the gradual deconcentration of wealth and the replacement of the very top wealth holders by the patrimonial middle class. If we examine incomes from work, and in particular the high remunerations paid to managers, we find that these tax rates drastically decrease the possibility of accumulating large fortunes, and above all, they radically transform the conditions for negotiating and setting these very generous remunerations, and thus, in the end, benefit those with the smallest remunerations. The available data show that this second effect was very important, especially in the United States. Concretely, the 80 to 90% tax rates implemented under Roosevelt and during the post-war period led companies to put an end to the most astronomical remunerations, whose cost increasingly appeared to be excessive when compared with the real benefit to the manager and with alternative uses. These super-remunerations melted away, which left more funds to be invested and used to raise lower salaries. The data show that the redistributive effect of confiscatory tax rates was principally the result of predistribution, which also implies that a simple examination of the effective tax rates paid by the various centiles allows us to measure only part of the total effect. Comparison of different countries also indicates that this fiscal mechanism was even more efficient when employees became involved in setting and monitoring remunerations and salary scales. For example, through union representatives on boards of directors in Germanic and Nordic Europe, or on the War Labor Board in the United States. This was a tripartite authority, government, unions, employers, set up to monitor salaries and smooth social relations. The data available at the level of the companies and of the different sectors and countries concerned also allow us to establish that beyond a certain level, there is no meaningful relation between manager salaries and their economic performance, and that these remunerations have mainly negative effects on low and middle-level salaries. On this subject, let us add that the rise in power of strongly progressive taxation seems in no way to have discouraged innovation or productivity. In the United States, the national income per inhabitant rose at a rate of 1.8% per annum between 1870 and 1910 without an income tax, and then at 2.1% between 1910 and 1950 after its introduction, and at a rate of 2.2% between 1950 and 1990, when the top tax rate reached, on average, 72%. The top rate was then cut in half, with the announced objective of boosting growth. But in fact, growth fell by half, reaching 1.1% per annum between 1990 and 2020. See Figure 23 in the PDF. Beyond a certain level of inequality, repeatedly increasing differences in income and wealth has clearly had no positive effect on economic dynamism. We find the same results in Europe. Fiscal progressivity was maximal during the period between 1950 and 1990, and so was growth, which later decreased along with progressivity. The results, however, are harder to interpret in the case of Europe. Growth there was particularly weak between 1910 and 1950 owing to the wars, leading to a catch-up effect later on. There is no catch-up effect of this kind in the United States. Growth from 1910 to 1950 is intermediary between those of the periods 1870 to 1910 and 1950 to 1990, and thus makes the comparison more meaningful. In sum, all the data at our disposal today suggests that virtually confiscatory tax rates have been an immense historical success. They have made it possible to greatly reduce the divergencies of fortunes and incomes, while at the same time improving the situation of the middle and lower classes, developing the welfare state, and stimulating better economic and social performance overall. Historically, it is the battle for equality and education that has made economic development and human progress possible, and not the veneration of property, stability, and inequality. On this subject, note the stagnation of educational investment since 1980 to 1990, Figure 19 in the PDF, an evolution that is paradoxical on the historical scale, given the increase in the number of university students, and that appears to be one of the most plausible explanations for the decline of growth. The liquidation of colonial assets and public debts. After the welfare state and progressive taxation, the third factor characterizing the Great Redistribution of the 1914 to 1980 period is the liquidation of foreign and colonial assets, and then of the public debts that had been incurred during that period. On the eve of World War I, property owners' prosperity seemed unshakable. The total value of private assets ranged from 6 to 8 years of national income in the United Kingdom, France, and Germany. See Figure 24 in the PDF. The available sources allow us to estimate that the total value of private properties was located at about this level from 1700 to 1914 in the United Kingdom and France, but with a radical transformation of the forms of property. Agricultural land represented 2/3 of goods at the beginning of the 18th century, and then was gradually replaced by industrial and international unmovable assets. Moreover, these assets were very concentrated. The richest 10% held between 80 and 90% of the total. Between 1914 and 1950, we see a veritable collapse of private property. The total value of goods was between 2 and 3 years of national income in the 1950s, and then began to increase slowly again up to our own time, without, however, fully returning to its starting point, and especially without ever regaining its earlier concentration. This collapse of private property is explained first by the destruction of goods, such as factories, buildings, and houses, caused by battles and bombardments during the 2 world wars. This represented between 1/4 and 1/3 of the decline in France and Germany, and a few percent in the United Kingdom. It is also explained by a set of policies that sought deliberately to reduce the power of property owners: rent freezes, nationalizations, financial and economic regulation, and labor union rights, among others. These very diverse policies all sought to reduce the monetary value of goods for private property owners, but not their social value for consumers. Thus, it was a question of redistributing power and not of losing real value. Finally, the third and most important reason, responsible for between 1/3 and half of the collapse in France and Germany, and almost 2/3 in the United Kingdom, was the liquidation of foreign assets and then of public debts. There, too, it is essentially a question of redistribution and not destruction. Colonized peoples and post-war taxpayers became freer as a result. This liquidation took place in 2 phases. The foreign assets were destroyed or transformed into public debts, and then the latter were themselves liquidated. To properly understand these events, we must first recognize that at the beginning of the 20th century, international assets had reached a level completely unprecedented in history and never attained since. See Figure 25 in the PDF. For instance, in 1914, net foreign assets rose to almost 2 years of national income for British property owners, or more than 1/4 of what they owned, and almost 1.5 years for French property owners, nearly 1/5 of their possessions. These assets were held in the colonial empires, such as the rubber plantations in Indochina and the timber industry in the Congo, but also in many territories that were not, strictly speaking, colonies, but with which the United Kingdom and France maintained very hierarchized relations. For example, the oil wells in the Ottoman Empire in Persia, the railroads and public and private debt securities in Russia, China, and Latin America. The importance of colonial and international assets is clearly visible at the individual level in Parisian inheritance records. Between 1872 and 1912, foreign investments rose from 6% to 21% in the total of goods transmitted after a death, with a still greater increase in the largest inheritances. These international investments returned considerable income in the form of profits, dividends, interests, rents, and royalties to their owners, about 5% of supplementary income for France, or the equivalent of the total industrial production of the departments in the countries north and east, which are the most industrialized, and almost 10% for the United Kingdom. This way of accounting in terms of money is revealing, but it underestimates the actual size of colonial extraction, which can be correctly gauged only by favoring a multidimensional approach expressed in terms of material flows, such as cotton, wood, and oil. See Chapter 3. This is also what allowed the two principal powers of the time to be almost constantly in commercial deficit with regard to the rest of the world between 1880 and 1914, between 1 and 2% of the national income on average. The revenues derived from foreign assets largely covered this deficit, while at the same time leaving considerable financial means that made it possible to continue colonizing the rest of the world and accumulating new assets. In reality, the pace of the accumulation of foreign assets by France and Britain between 1880 and 1914 was so excessive that it simply became untenable in the long term, for reasons both external and internal. The accumulation was so rapid that had it continued a few decades longer, European powers would have been in a position to colonize almost the whole planet. The logic of colonial extraction and of these international possessions was often accompanied by violence. This considerable brutality took the form of virtually forced or poorly paid labor, degraded working conditions, discrimination, and more generally, a great indifference to human suffering. The Irish famine of 1845 to 1848, which left around 1 million dead and sent 1.5 million emigrants abroad from a total population of 8 million, has often been compared in its magnitude to the Bengal famine of 1943 to 1944, which killed 4 million out of a population of 50 million. In Ireland, as in Bengal, the British elites knew what was happening and refused to take the steps required to avoid a tragedy, in some cases with the almost explicit goal of a Malthusian regulation of an impoverished population, and a rebellious one at that. During the following decades, the Irish famine fed a deep resentment toward British property owners, refusal to pay rents, and occupation of plots of land, followed by a powerful movement that led first to the redistribution of land and then to that country's independence. This treatment could only help feed national liberation movements and favor their final victories, a process the two world wars merely accelerated. Within Europe, the magnitude of the financial flows and of the profits realized was known to everyone, and colonial assets aroused increasingly ferocious greed and rivalries. In his classic book, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, 1916, Lenin had used, of course, the statistics on financial investments available at that time to show the enormity of the colonial powers' race to seize natural resources. Germany, which had become at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th the continent's leading power, demographically and industrially, was much less well endowed with foreign assets than the United Kingdom and France were. The Moroccan crisis of 1911 almost triggered hostilities, but Germany finally accepted the Franco-British Agreement of 1904 regarding Morocco and Egypt, while at the same time obtaining a compensation in Cameroon. This made it possible to delay war for a few years. The next spark ignited the conflict. The beginnings of hostilities led to the collapse of foreign assets. British and French possessions were reconstituted to some extent during the 1920s, partly thanks to the distribution of German colonial assets, but then disappeared definitively following World War II. Between 1914 and the 1950s, history's greatest international possessions totally disappeared, See Figure 25 in the PDF. This is explained in part by a series of expropriations following revolutionary processes and wars of independence. After the 1917 revolution, the new Soviet state decided to repudiate all the debts accumulated by the Tsarist regime. In 1918 to 1920, a military expedition was conducted in northern Russia by the United Kingdom, France, and the United States in the hope of crushing the revolution, but it failed. At the other end of the period, Egypt decided in 1956 to nationalize the Suez Canal, which had given its Franco-British stockholders solid dividends ever since it was constructed in 1869. Once again, the United Kingdom and France envisioned a military operation, as they had so often done in the past. But this time they were let down by the United States, which could not take the risk of allowing the Global South to fall into the hands of the Soviet Union. The colonial powers no longer existed. In addition to the expropriations, the wars themselves were to cost European property owners dear. To finance an unprecedented level of violence, holders of foreign assets sold an increasing share of their credits to make loans to their governments, which, as was only proper, promised to repay them, cash on the barrelhead, after the war. This promise could never be kept. In the hope of being able to bail out its property owners, the French state imposed an incredible war debt on Germany in the Treaty of Versailles, around 300% of the German national income, at a time when the country was already on its knees. It will be noted that this is approximately the same proportion of the national income as the debt imposed on Haiti in 1825, about 300%, with the difference being that Germany had the means to defend itself. The French authorities considered the amount justified. In 1871, France was obligated to pay the equivalent of 30% of its national income to Germany, and the damage caused by the fighting between 1914 and 1918 was far more extensive. In reality, the system had reached the point of breakdown. In Mein Kampf, written in 1924 when French troops were occupying the Ruhr to recover their property, Adolf Hitler constantly refers to this infamous tribute, which was imposed, moreover, by a people in demographic decline, and concludes that only the formation of a superior state power would make it possible for the German people to hold their heads high and finally carve out their own colonial empire. Along with its pathological anti-Semitism, the text's other great obsession was the hordes of blacks that the French occupying force had brought to the banks of the Rhine. Hitler suspected the French of preparing to wipe out the last remains of pure blood and seeking to constitute an immense mixed-blood state that would extend from the Congo to the Rhine. The fear of the Great Replacement was already accompanied by a fear of a great mixing of blood. The financial crash of 1929, followed by the battles of World War II, led to the ultimate collapse of colonial assets and the powers that had dominated the world until 1914, powers that were inseparably connected to property ownership and colonialism. The Reconstruction of Europe through the cancellation of public debts. Around 1945 to 1950, the principal European states were saddled with enormous public debts, between 200 and 300% of the national income. See Figure 26 in the PDF. In large part, these were the result, 30 years later, of foreign assets that had been gradually sold to finance wars. See Figure 25 in the PDF. Most of these countries chose not to repay these debts. They instead turned to other economic and social priorities, combining three series of measures that had already been tried after World War I: cancellations, pure and simple, inflation, and exceptional levies on private wealth. In France, inflation exceeded 50% per annum for 4 consecutive years, from 1945 through 1948. The public debt was destroyed, as surely as a factory could be destroyed by bombardment. The problem was that millions of ordinary people with small savings accounts were also ruined, whereas wealthier individuals, who had sold their public debt securities at the right time and bought stocks or real estate instead, were affected little or not at all. This inflation aggravated a poverty already endemic among elderly people in the 1950s and aroused a deep feeling of injustice. In West Germany, where the traumatic memory of the hyperinflation of 1923 was still very near, more sophisticated solutions were tried. The monetary reform of 1948 replaced old debt securities worth 100 German marks with securities worth 1 mark in the new money, while at the same time protecting the smallest savings with the help of a scale. The debt disappeared without provoking inflation. Above all, in 1952, the Bundestag adopted a mechanism known as burden sharing, Lastenausgleich, which consisted in a levy of up to 50% on the largest financial, business, and real estate assets, whatever their nature, making it possible to finance compensations for holders of small and middle-sized fortunes crippled by the destructive effects of war and monetary reform. The system was far from perfect, but it involved considerable sums, about 60% of the German national income in 1952, with payments spread over 30 years, and it represented an ambitious and largely successful attempt to reconstruct the country on a more just basis of social equality. Germany also benefited from a cancellation of its foreign debt during the London Conference of 1953, which helped increase the margins available for reconstruction, social welfare expenditures, and investments in infrastructure and training. More precisely, the internal debt was suspended in 1953 and then finally canceled when Germany was reunited in 1991. In Japan, the exceptional levy implemented in 1946 to 1947 affected 90% of the largest portfolios and also made it possible to accelerate the settlement of war-related accounts. Retrospectively, these policies were very successful, in the sense that they made it possible to get rid of the debts of the past in just a few years and turn toward the future and reconstruction. If it had been necessary to pay off these debts by ordinary means, without cancellation or inflation, without exceptional levies on private wealth, and with budgetary deficits accumulating year after year, then we would still be reimbursing interest to heirs who received colonial and domestic assets from the period before 1914. This strategy of reimbursing property owners over the long term was the one chosen by the United Kingdom in the 19th century, though it is true that it is hard to see what government could have imposed this after the war, or moreover, what government could establish it in future decades. However, we must remember that the decisions made in 1945 to 1950 involved gigantic political battles and were bitterly debated. After a long and conflict-ridden process, the liquidation of international assets and public debts ultimately played a major role in the reduction of income and property inequalities, enabling the Great Redistribution that took place between 1914 and 1980.